Hello and welcome to lecture number 51. This is topic 3.16, the Great Migration. There's two learning objectives today, and the first one is to describe the causes of the Great Migration. The Great Migration was one of the largest internal migrations in U.S. history. It lasted from the 1910s to the 1970s and was the first major voluntary migration of African Americans. The previous ones were the Middle Passage and the domestic slave trade. The migration happened in waves. In total, 6 million African Americans relocated to northern cities. Initially, the waves were younger. Most people moving had been born in the 1880s and 1890s, and they had no recollection of slavery. Therefore, they had a brighter outlook and future for what they had believed they should achieve as citizens of this country. The migration often happened via chain migration, meaning that one family member, a father, sister, or uncle, would move to the north first, find a job or place to live, and then send for the rest of the family. All other acquaintances or family members would follow to the same city. This resulted in entire communities from one town living in one neighborhood across various urban cities in the north. Migrants settled in the north, the Midwest, and the western United States in major cities like New York City, Philadelphia, Chicago, Cleveland, and Los Angeles. The black population outside of the South doubled by 1940, and from the table on the screen, you can see that the decade with the largest amount of migration was in the 1940s. Why the migration happened relates to several different causes. The first we'll look at are economic causes. Jobs in the North and labor shortages caused by World War I and World War II drew African Americans to northern cities to fill labor gaps, as they were offering higher wages than those available in the South. Also, the wars interrupted European migrations, which had been the traditional source of cheap labor for northern cities. This interruption was significant because during periods of heavy European immigration in the late 1800s, labor supply had kept wages low for both black and white workers. Because of the wars, European countries increased their demand for American goods, and to fill labor shortages, labor agents were sent to recruit southern black workers for jobs in industrial factories like steel mills, railroads, and meatpacking plants in Chicago, and the automobile industry in Detroit. African Americans found exponentially better pay. In the North, black workers could make a full month's wage in 1 week compared to their wages in the South. This economic opportunity was a huge draw for those seeking better financial conditions. However, some had to escape the limitations of sharecropping contracts or debt that tied them to the land. As sharecroppers, they could not leave in the middle of a growing season and had to wait until the end of the season when accounts with landowners were settled. At that point, sharecroppers would either make some profit or owe money, leading to a difficult conversation about leaving. There were also environmental push factors. A series of floods in the early 1900s displaced thousands of farmers in Mississippi and Alabama. The Great Mississippi Flood of 1927 was especially devastating. Around 500 people died and over 630,000 were directly affected. This event was one of the deadliest natural disasters in U.S. history, with 94% of those affected being African American. The federal government's inadequate response also revealed stark racial disparities in relief efforts, as supplies and means of evacuation after flooding were given strictly to white citizens, with blacks receiving only the leftovers. The Mississippi Delta region was particularly impacted, and many found it easier to start over elsewhere rather than to rebuild in the South. Additionally, boll weevil infestations were another environmental push factor. These small insects destroyed millions of acres of cotton crops, further reducing the income that sharecroppers could earn. Spoiled crops were another problem. As a result of soil exhaustion or weather events like drought, the land was less capable of producing healthy crops. So the susceptibility to crop spoiling on the fields was another factor for southern black farmers to make their way north. Social causes were also significant push factors in the form of discrimination, lynching, and racial violence. African Americans relocated to the North in search of safety for their families. Lynching became common in the South during the 1890s, with over 1,000 lynchings occurring in that decade alone. In the first decade of the 20th century, there were about 800 lynchings. This period marked a violent backlash to the progress black Americans were making during Reconstruction, when black political power briefly expanded before the establishment of Jim Crow laws. Discrimination and segregation through Jim Crow laws made life in the South unbearable. African Americans lived in constant fear of being wrongly accused of a crime, and they risked being lynched, mutilated, or killed without a trial. By the early 1900s, race riots and massacres further terrorized black communities. The 1906 Atlanta race riot, the 1917 East St. Louis riots, the 1919 Elaine massacre in Arkansas, and the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre were particularly violent events documented by journalists like Ida B. Wells Barnett. Though African Americans fled Southern violence, they still faced discrimination in the North, though it was less overt. For example, YMCA facilities in northern cities often barred black men from using their services. Racial tensions in northern cities also led to violent incidents such as the 1919 Chicago race riot. Despite these challenges, northern migrants could vote for the first time in their lives, which was a significant enough incentive for moving. Transportation and communication improvements also facilitated migration. The expanding railway system offered cheaper travel, with new routes connecting southern and northern cities. Two major railroads were particularly important: the Illinois Central Railroad, which connected New Orleans to Chicago, and the Atlantic Coast Line Railroad, which connected Florida to New York City. These railways played a crucial role not only in transporting people but also fostering cultural connections between the North and the South. Northern black newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender actively promoted migration by printing stories of people who had successfully made the move. Black railroad workers such as Pullman porters brought these papers to the South to encourage further migration. The second learning objective is to explain the impact of the Great Migration on black communities and American culture. The destination of black migrants often depended on the region of origin. For example, those from the East Coast, like the Carolinas and Virginia, often moved to cities like Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, or New York City. Migrants from Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi frequently went to Pittsburgh, Cleveland, or Detroit, while those from the Mississippi River region, such as Louisiana and Arkansas, headed to Chicago. These migration patterns were also shaped by historical trade routes and pre-existing transportation networks. The migration transformed American cities, often doubling the percentage of black residents. Some cities had little or no black populations before the Great Migration. Housing segregation led to black residents concentrating in specific neighborhoods, such as Harlem and New York City. This created new cultural hubs, despite the fact that black families often paid higher rents than their white counterparts for similar apartments in other parts of the city. Despite housing discrimination, black cultural movements flourished, such as the Harlem Renaissance. This movement began in the 1920s, and it was a major artistic and intellectual revival led by figures like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, whose work celebrated black identity. People often moved in groups, and entire communities sometimes relocated together. Church congregations and migration clubs played a vital role in facilitating the mass movements, helping entire cities and towns move en masse. Migrants brought their religious faith with them, which was central to maintaining their sense of community and identity in unfamiliar northern cities. For example, the Azusa Street Church in Los Angeles was helpful in the spread of Pentecostal movements. The Azusa Street Revival of 1906, led by African-American preacher William J. Seymour, is widely considered the birth of the modern Pentecostalism, which soon spread across the nation as migrants carried their new faith to northern cities. Migrants usually maintained a strong connection with the South. They visited family members, sent money back home, and stayed in close contact with their communities. This continuous interaction created a shared culture among African American communities across the country. This trans-regional connection was important as it helped solidify a sense of collective identity and solidarity among African Americans, leading to a rise of influential political and cultural movements such as the Civil Rights Movement. By sending remittances and maintaining cultural practices, Southern traditions influenced the developing urban black culture in northern cities, while urban experiences began to reshape Southern life. This ongoing exchange helped to bridge regional divides and created a unified African American culture that was distinctly national in its reach. The shift from rural to urban living changed Black Americans' lifestyles, especially in terms of leisure. They embraced the entertainments of cities, with jazz clubs and theaters becoming important spaces for cultural expression. However, overcrowding in Black neighborhoods often led to issues like crime, prostitution, and the spread of disease such as tuberculosis. Black Southerners forged new connections to their northern environments in various ways. One of the most significant changes was how they engaged in leisure activities. Previously in the South, outdoor activities were often limited to working in the fields. However, after migrating north, they began to enjoy nature and the outdoors in a new way. Public parks, beaches, and other recreational spaces became central to leisure activities for Black migrants, offering them opportunities to relaxation and community gatherings that had been rare or inaccessible in the rural South. Additionally, the rise of organized sports leagues in northern cities provided another avenue for recreation and community building. Migrants could join leagues to play football or baseball, two sports that were gaining popularity in the early 1900s. Baseball in particular became a key sport for African American communities, leading to the establishment of the Negro Leagues in 1920, which provided a platform for Black athletes at a time when Major League Baseball was segregated. These leagues became not only a source of pride, but also a powerful symbol of Black excellence and resilience. The involvement in sports also helped foster new social networks and contributed to the overall development of Black urban culture. As migrants adjusted to city life, participation in team sports, whether at local parks or in more organized settings, provided a sense of camaraderie and belonging, helping them navigate their environments while maintaining community cohesion. Once the Great Migration was in full swing in the 1900s, Southerners began to respond to the massive outflow of underpaid and disempowered Black laborers. As more African Americans left the South, Southern employers and plantation owners became increasingly worried that they would not have enough workers to maintain their plantations. Since sharecroppers and tenant farmers were finding new opportunities in the North, Southerners actively resisted the migration. One of the strategies used by Southern employers was to impose restrictions on labor agents who came to recruit Black workers. These agents were required to obtain licenses, and in some cases, local authorities forced them out of town or arrested them for soliciting workers. Additionally, Black individuals who were planning to leave were targeted with unjust arrests or under labor or vagrancy laws. Local officials would sometimes enforce rules about fulfilling the length of a sharecropping contract, or they would simply jail people to prevent them from catching their trains to the north. Despite these obstacles, many African Americans managed to leave, but not without considerable effort and risk. Interestingly, as more African Americans left, conditions in the South improved slightly for those who remained. The scarcity of labor forced some white Southerners to treat the remaining Black workers a bit better, offering slightly improved conditions in an effort to keep them from joining the migration northward. This was a marked shift from the rigid social order maintained under Jim Crow, showing the power of labor mobility in disrupting oppressive systems. Nonetheless, the overall inequality and exploitation continued, even if slightly alleviated for some. The National Urban League, founded in New York City in 1910, was an interracial organization established by Ruth Standish Baldwin, a white philanthropist, and Dr. George Edmund Haynes, a prominent Black scholar and sociologist. Its primary mission was to help Black migrants acclimate to urban life, especially during the Great Migration. Before the founding of the National Urban League, Black migrants primarily relied on independent Black settlement houses for assistance. These houses struggled to gain support from mainstream organizations like the YMCA and YWCA, which maintained segregationist practices at the time. The social workers at the National Urban League played a crucial role in helping newcomers secure housing and jobs. They provided housing referrals and supported Black-owned housing initiatives, enabling migrants to avoid the barriers of racial discrimination in the rental market. The League's approach represented a shift from charity to empowerment, emphasizing self-reliance and community building as a central tenet of their work. As the 20th century progressed, the National Urban League evolved into a major civil rights organization. One of its early significant actions was supporting A. Philip Randolph's idea for a March on Washington in 1941. This march was planned to protest discrimination in the war industries, which continued to exclude or marginalize Black workers despite the ongoing demand for labor during World War II. This pressure led President Franklin D. Roosevelt in issuing Executive Order 8802, prohibiting racial discrimination in defense industries, the first major federal action to promote equal employment opportunities. Although the 1941 march was called off after Roosevelt's action, the spirit of the movement persisted, and the idea eventually came to fruition with the iconic 1963 March on Washington. At that time, Whitney Young, then president of the National Urban League, played a key role. In the famous photograph seen on the screen, you can see Young seated with other civil rights leaders, including A. Philip Randolph, Martin Luther King Jr., Roy Wilkins, and John Lewis, showing the close collaboration among these historic figures. During the Civil Rights Movement, the National Urban League worked directly with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, and other civil rights organizations to promote equality and justice. Unlike some other civil rights groups that focused on direct action and protest, the Urban League stressed economic empowerment, job training, and advocating for systemic reforms in employment and housing policies. This complementary approach between organizations allowed the civil rights movement to tackle racial injustice from multiple angles, creating broader, lasting change in American society. All right, and finally for the recap, the Great Migration lasted from 1910 to the 1970s, with over 6 million African Americans moving north. The causes included better working opportunities, less discrimination, environmental factors, and improved transportation. Black populations in northern cities doubled, creating cultural movements, and although migrants faced challenges, they adopted and transformed their new environments. Finally, the National Urban League played a significant role in helping migrants transition to urban life, contributing to broader civil rights efforts.
Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, click the thumbnail on the screen. And if you would like more resources to help you study, you can visit apushslides.com/afam. I wish you the best of luck with your studies, and I hope to see you back on the next lecture.